Okay. I think we're ready to begin the afternoon session of Session 2. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the panel you're about to see, Ken Koedinger, who is the professor of human-computer interaction and psychology and the co-director of the Pittsburgh Sciences of Learning Center, and someone who's been a friend of mine and a collaborator for, I think, 30 years now. Is that right? Yeah. So I think Ken's been a pioneer in collecting and analyzing big data and using it in the right way for educational learning gains for an awful long time. So he's really a perfect person to lead this panel. So welcome.
So I'm excited to kick off this panel on big data in service of better learning. And Alfred Spector from Google is co-moderating with me. And we're addressing this question of what are the challenges and opportunities in establishing an evidence-based culture for improving technology-enhanced learning. The target here is better learning outcomes, as the image is meant to represent. You know, one thing to reflect on is why are we so excited about the possibility of data in education? And certainly one of the aspects of that is the power of data in machine learning that we're seeing in other areas of science and in commerce. Can that be applied in education? There's also in education increasing availability of data as more and more educational technologies get into greater and greater use. There's pressure to demonstrate value in education, and that pressure has been present for a long time at the K-12 level through the accountability movement, but we're increasingly seeing pressure on colleges and universities as well to demonstrate learning outcomes, you know, including accusations like we're academically adrift with respect to our university output. Can we respond to that pressure to demonstrate value? And in particular, I think a very important fourth feature is an increasing recognition that science is relevant in education, that we can do evidence-based design and decision-making in this area. And one way to think about how data can have an impact here is in thinking about the different kinds of stakeholders and the feedback loops that data can be applied to, for instance, in feedback directly to the student. In learning by doing environments where students are engaged in activities, we get data on from their responses, and systems, intelligent tutoring systems, and other kinds of adaptive systems can adapt to students' needs on the way. And there's been quite a good amount of evidence that these kinds of adaptive systems can increase achievement. Some of the work that funded by Tom Brock's organization has evaluated our cognitive tutor algebra course, a recent 2013 study showing doubling of algebra achievement over a school year. And importantly, this result indicates all students are improving at both the low and the high end of the distributions. Related to a point Tom Khalil made this morning, we're starting to think about measuring effects of these courses in terms of the learning rate that students experience over a full school year and how the treatment, in this case, is essentially doubling that effect. Another element, a stakeholder in these feedback loops of data is instructors. So can we use online activity data to inform instructors and accelerate learning? A nice example of that comes from the Open Learning Initiative that you heard a little bit about from Marcia Lovett this morning. Here, interactive activities not only provide feedback to students, but provide feedback to instructors. And instructors are using that information to adapt what they do in face-to-face presentations in their course. And the studies she told us about this morning, we saw really dramatic gains in terms of an efficiency of delivering a course in a half semester, and at the same time improving learning outcomes from this kind of feedback to students and instructors. The third and fourth stakeholders here are course developers and learning scientists towards improving courses and making discoveries about how learning works. And number of organizations have emerged. Our Learn Lab Science of Learning Center here in Pittsburgh, but Ryan Baker here has been the president of the Educational Data Mining Society for it's close to 10 years now. We've seen the emergence of the Society for Research on Effective Education through the IES that Tom Brooks runs. And these organizations have produced a lot of great examples of ways that we can make improvements and make discoveries, accurately predicting state tests from online data, discovering better models of learners that can be used to identify barriers and improve courses, contributing to student discussion through machine learning on text, detecting and responding to student motivation and affect. So a lot of great things. But one of the challenges I think that we should think about, one of the many challenges, is can we get everyday instructors involved in data analytics and lower the barrier to entry for those kinds of folks? So if you had a chance to see one of the demos today, there was a gradebook analytics effort to lower those barriers. But in one of the breakouts this afternoon, I hope we get some more opportunity to discuss other ways we could help instructors get into the game of evidence-based decision making. We've specifically asked our 6 panelists in the days before this to think about 7 questions. The first here is on this personalization issue. A second is how important is it to interpret machine learning results versus let machine learning do its magic? I think it's a very critical question in this domain. There's questions about how do we address different kinds of stakeholder needs. The privacy and intellectual property issues are big. We need to think about preparing new contributors to this as we think about the future of learning engineers. Can we have people better trained in using data and courseware? How do we get there? Can we build infrastructures that are going to help us use data to meet these needs of the different stakeholders? And finally, to what extent can this group, the Global Learning Council, help contribute to this area? So we have 6 great panelists that represent a wide variety of different perspectives on this approach and on these questions. Each is going to give us a 5-minute overview of their thoughts, and then Alfred Spector will take over and reflect on what they said and open it up for questions from each of you. So I won't introduce folks, but I'll let each say a little bit about themselves and about what's going on, starting with Matthias.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much to Zura Suresh to invited me. I'm by training, I'm a mechanical engineer. By I must say, by my enthusiasm, I'm a researcher in the field of manufacturing, but by election, I'm president of the Liebniz Association, and I would like to give you a short sketch on this. Subra, in his former capacity as director of the NSF, was a close partner to me as I was president of the German Research Foundation, DFG, before I joined the Leibniz Association. The Leibniz Association connects 89 independent, publicly funded research institutions in Germany and is very much engaged in the field of educational research and in the field of educational research data. Leibniz covers, moreover, the whole range of academic disciplines from humanities, the social sciences, the life sciences, natural sciences, and engineering. As you know, a president oversees everything but knows nothing. I'm really glad that 2 of my Leibniz colleagues have joined me here at the Global Learning Council. One is Friedrich Hesse, he's vice president of the association, but maybe what is more important, director of the Knowledge Media Research Center, KMRC, and head of the Department of Applied Cognitive Psychology at the University of Tübingen. He has a long-lasting cooperation with colleagues from Pittsburgh. The KMRC runs the platform eteaching.org, which is among the first of its kind in Germany. Since it has been running for so long now, the platform is representative for the evolution of innovative education strategies. Today, eteaching.org offers Moocs, but more precisely CMOOCs, called COER, course on open education resources, that increases the KMRC's researchers' insights and keeps providing them with more and more data about the new learning environment. The development of Moocs in Germany differs, I would say, significantly from that in the US. The KMRC Leibniz Institute's own platform illuminates the specific path which Moocs have taken in Germany. Namely, Moocs in Germany have not development within the public outreach of elite universities, but initially as government-subsidized initiatives. But in recent years, Moocs have evolved really without much state funding at individual universities. The second colleague is Olaf Köller. He is Managing Director of the Leibniz Institutes for Science and Mathematics Education, IPN, and full professor of educational research at Kiel University. The Leibniz IPN's mission is to develop and promote science and mathematics education through research. At the IPN, teams of scientists, experts in science and mathematics education, teachers and psychologists work together with a focus on fundamental research questions concerning teaching and learning of science and mathematics. Moreover, there are two Leibniz institutes in this field. One is the German Institute for International Educational Research, and the second, which is for the question of research data, I think very important. It's the Leibniz Institute for Educational Trajectories, which carries the National Educational Panel Studies, a really long-lasting study, I think over some decades, with some 10,000 of people involved. Leibniz stands for cooperative science, for research in networks within a specific disciplinary area, but moreover in a very intensive cross-disciplinary way. Hence, let me now add a few sentences about two Leibniz research alliances which addresses questions of new learning and teaching environments in the national inter- and transdisciplinary Leibniz mode, such as continuity and sustainable learning, technical didactical learning and training, support and information for students applying digital learning platforms, consequences of selective learning paths, and consequences of missing personal contact and exchange against the background of theories of embodied cognition. The first Leibniz Research Alliance I would like to mention is Science 2.0. It is dedicated to the investigation of fundamental transformations which education as well as research are currently going through, from which they benefit and are challenged by at the same time. As we all know, learning and teaching environments at schools and universities have been changed immensely by new data, by new media, in particular by the internet and the social media. Science 2.0 especially addresses the learning and teaching researcher. His or her changed working habits are investigated. For example, blogs seem to serve as a valuable source of new research ideas. In blogs, barriers between teachers and students are typically much lower. You know the sense in the internet, nobody cares that you are a professor. But also the engagement of people in general within research contexts, so-called citizen science, is a phenomenon fueled by the new information environments. And the development of new tools for teaching and research is one major focus. And I would say, in summary, our researchers join forces together, cognitive, sociological, historical, and technical expertise in order to provide comprehensive insights in the Science 2.0 universe. There's a second alliance, the Leibniz Education Research Alliance. It also centers on the core aspect of knowledge and participation. How can the potentials of education and for education be put to a better use? I just want to mention this alliance very shortly. At the end, reacting to your question on infrastructure, which was who will pay for curation and storage of data, who will make the rules, I think my answer necessarily touches only the tip of the iceberg, relating to the somewhat bigger question on how to set up information infrastructure, how realize open access not only to publications, but moreover to research data and research infrastructure in general and in the future. Indeed, the topic of establishing an information infrastructure in a strategic sense was the focus of this year's national meeting of German university rectors. It is obvious that it makes a lot of sense to deal with this matters like this coordinately, rather than each university or research organizations acts individually on its own. We need, for example, agreements on standards, and I think for this the Global Learning Council could be a very, very helpful instrument. The German government has installed an advisory board for information infrastructure, which will help to develop solutions in this field. 4 big research libraries and institutions for information infrastructure belong to the Leibniz Association, and we are very intensively involved in this Federal Advisory Board for Information Infrastructure. And as usually, it will be a question of priorities. And maybe as a last remark, what unique role can the GLC play in this arena? The Global Learning Council can offer a platform for professional exchange among schools and universities. It can propagate best practices and thereby also help to avoid the repetition of mistakes. GLC could also be an advisor for public funders, especially in opening research data to the community, and ideally the Global Learning Council can be a catalyst for modern, sophisticated learning environments. Thank you very much.
Anant, your opening statement?
Sure. Good afternoon. I'm Anant Agarwal. I'm the CEO of edX and also a professor of EECS at MIT. I would like to talk a little bit about big data and how we can gather this big data, what we can use it for, what are some of the privacy challenges. My plan here will be to tease you with some thoughts so that we can discuss them at more depth during the panel discussion. And so in my 5 minutes, let me give you a quick overview. So edX is an online learning destination. We have about close to 3 million students from every country in the world. So for example, we have close to 20,000 students from Korea. We have 300,000 students from India. So students all over the world of all walks of life, high schoolers, middle schoolers, all the way to people who are 92 years old. And since we launched edX in December of 2011, right from day one, the idea of research and online learning and big data in the mission of understanding about learning and improving learning was a fundamental part of our mission. And so from the very first mouse click on edX, we've gathered every single piece of data. So for example, when a student, we know what time a student clicked on a piece of text. We know what time they started a video. We know when the video wasn't progressed for a period of time. If they get an answer correct, we know what was the previous resource accessed by the student. We know what answers they gave. I mean, we know everything. So the first thing we can do is that there's massive amounts of data. And today, just 2 years into it, we've gathered close to 4 billion, not million, but billion records of learning data. And as I said, from a very diverse group of students. And for each of those data clicks, we have a lot of background information of the student. As a nonprofit, we like big enrollments, but we figured we want to gather a lot of student demographic data. So when students register on edX, we gather about 10 pieces of data from the students. So we know their educational background, we know why they're doing this, where they are from, their address, so on and so forth, which the commercial providers will not do because that reduces enrollments. So with commercial providers, you give your email, boom, you're in. But here, in the service of learning, in the service of big data, we're doing many things that any e-commerce VC would have a heart attack if they saw if they saw their company doing it. But research is important, so we gather all that data. So just to give you a sense of what is possible, so one example, a researcher, Philip Guo, from the University of Rochester, he came by and did some research. And the idea was we all had a question, how long should videos be? Lectures are an hour or an hour and a half. Videos range from 1 minute to many professors feel that, God dang it, my video should be 50 minutes long. Anything less than that won't let me get the depth of the meaning and so on and so forth into the lecture. And we have no idea. A lot of people had guesses and some early studies with small piece of data. So Philip Guo did a study with a modest number of video watching sessions, 5 million. Across many courses, across many universities, and these were on the first 5 or 10 courses of edX. And he showed that the median, if he plotted the video length on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, how many minutes did students engage with the video? And he produced the magic number, 6 minutes. And so now, people will be quoting the number that says 6 minutes is the optimal time for videos in these online learning classes where you may interleave video with interactive exercises in active learning models, but video should be about 6 minutes long. And in the past, people would not quote that number, and this was, he wrote a paper, we blogged about it, we tweeted about it, and now everybody talks about 6 minutes. So just one example of the kind of data that you can get and the kind of analysis that you can do. There are big challenges. We have all of this data. Privacy is a big issue. At edX, we believe this data is covered by FERPA. Although we do get students to click on a privacy policy that essentially lets us and our research university partners do whatever they want with the data, frankly, students and others, when's the last time you read a terms of service when you went to Amazon? How many of you have read a terms of service in the past click that you did when you registered at a company? 0. One person, we need to talk. So students don't read that stuff. And so I think we have a higher moral obligation to be more careful with the data than the permissions the students have given us. So what we do is we share the data with the university partners. Each of them right now gets access to all of the learning data of their students. And there we establish a protocol. Each university has to assign what we call the data czar. We give the data, and on edX we're trying to reduce the time. So we give them data. They can, with one click, they can download all the data from edX in a documented JSON format. Data is tagged and all of that stuff. And we're trying to make it faster and faster so the data czar can click and boom, get a download of the data on a very timely basis. And at edX, we created a metric in engineering to see how short we can make that period. So that's batch data. And then the data czar in a university can then work with the other researchers. There's also online data. So on edX, we introduced A/B testing about a year ago. And now it's unleashed to all the professors. So every professor on edX, just imagine, you're a teacher. Some people don't like this, don't like the word engineer, but to me, engineer is a good thing. So every professor, every educator can now become an education engineer. They can all do A/B testing. So on the edX platform, it's not just Louis Fonan doing A/B testing on Duolingo. On edX, if you're an instructor teaching a course or an educator involved in a course, we have as part of the education platform studio, you can author your own A/B tests. Anybody can be an educator, engineer. And so you can introduce A/B tests, you can create multiple versions of the course, multiple versions of videos, and you can, the platform will divide up the students into as many tracks as there are sessions, so it's A, B, C, D, E testing. And then you can correlate on the results and see what worked, what did not work. Just imagine, every professor can now become an engineer. So that is online use of the data, and it's extremely powerful. And it took us a lot of effort to build a user interface to do that. We can talk about that some more. And finally, very briefly, what can the GLC do to help us? So we are sitting on this mountain of data, and right now we give it to our university partners because they've signed an agreement with edX. But we would like to make this data available to the world and share all the data. But there the key is, how do you de-identify the data? And if we can get researchers to agree on what constitutes de-identification, and there will be some risk involved, just agree on it. If the GLC can put their imprimatur that we believe that this is a form of de-identification we will stand behind, there is some risk because people have proven that you can never completely de-identify data. If the GLC can do that, then we would be more comfortable releasing the data, and I think for the greater good. Thank you.
Heidi, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Heidi Wachs. I'm a research director with the Gartner for Technical Professionals Identity and Privacy Strategies team. And my background is privacy. And before I joined Gartner, I was the chief privacy officer for Georgetown University. So I have a background in higher education as well, and got to learn a little bit about Moocs and online education as it was developing. My primary capacity there was reviewing a lot of contracts for privacy issues. And let me first start out by saying that I am certainly pro-education and pro-technological evolution, even though what I'm about to say may sound like I'm attempting to maybe put the brakes on just lightly on some of what we're doing. So, for example, what Anant is saying, it all sounds fantastic, but when he says we have 4 billion pieces of data and records, I break out into a cold sweat. Because there are automatically privacy issues there. And when he's talking about the ability to do A/B testing, I think, oh my God, that's amazing. Does that need to go past IRB? Is that human subjects research? What are we doing with the data that we're providing the professors with? When we talk about de-identification, I immediately want to talk about, well, if we take course listings and we take students who are geographically located in one place but they're moving to another, can we take what we thought was de-identified, mash it all back up together, and actually begin to figure out who these students are? And if we start tacking those to other course records and other education records, can we now figure out that a student who is now in college when they were in 5th grade displayed some behavioral issues that has been tacked along to their record, and they have the equivalent of a Scarlet A instead of a straight grade 4.0 A attached to their record. So that's sort of my perspective and the privacy perspective on a lot of these issues. I was asked to comment on what best practices would look like in this space, and I have to tell you, first, there have to be a lot more screw-ups before we can know what best practices look like.
Go out there and do it.
This is I'm definitely not saying go out there and just do it. But the problem is that best practices come when we've learned and tried and figured out what works and what doesn't work. So, for example, let's talk about the privacy field and privacy professionals as a whole. In terms of best practices, I know everybody likes to demonize the US and say we have horrible privacy laws and horrible privacy practices and there is no privacy. But the truth of the matter is there are some really basic privacy tenets that are adhered to in the US, and they mirror, even though perhaps not as stringently, what are adhered to around the world. So just a brief overview, those include things like notice and awareness, choice and consent, access and participation, integrity and security, and enforcement and redress. And you'll find those spelled out in various different ways by take your pick of US federal government agency. DHS has their version of what's called the FIPS, the Fair Information Practice Principles. Commerce has them too. NIST has published them as well. So there are some basic guidelines, and those basic guidelines include things that we're used to in a non-legal terminology, things like opt-in and notice and consent. And so in all of this that's going on, yeah, it's really not good to expect that everybody is going to read everything that's put in front of them, but there does need to be a very, very strong baseline level of transparency that whether it's the actual students or their parents, there needs to be flexibility because this is definitely a different model. But there needs to be transparency so that the learners and the students are made aware and the parents are made aware of what is being collected all along the way. And that's whether it's K through 12, that's whether it's public or private, that's whether it's online or whether it's in person. And the students and the parents should have the ability to inspect those records, to request that where there are errors, they're cleaned up, just like we all have the right to do with our credit reports, to challenge issues. And this is a messy area. There are going to have to be guidelines around that. Can a student argue that they want something expunged just because they don't like what was included in their record? No, sometimes there's going to be accurate but negative things that are said about a student and I'm not talking about, maybe they're acting out when they're 10 and that needs to go away by the time that they're 18. But there are things that students should have the right to request that are expunged, but there are also things that should stay with them and should be retained in the record. And I think these are the issues that need to be figured out. In terms of, what that's going to look like, in terms of human subject research or how this is treated, I think there are some really good models out there in other fields. I think the social sciences, I think the medical field has some really great examples of, not perfect, but good examples of how to take those massive amounts of data and work with them. I think the idea of de-identification is being torn down and torn apart every day as we figure out that there's so many disparate pieces of data that you can put back together and re-identify a person. So I think that that's an area that needs to be treaded lightly. I don't think we can just say it's as simple as de-identifying and then game over, it's done, and you can do whatever you want with the data. But these are, I think, some of the issues that need to be addressed moving forward. And I think the best practices will evolve, and they'll evolve from organizations like the GLC working together with AAU, APLU, EDUCAUSE, all of these organizations that work together to understand how education happens and how data can be used and shared.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ryan.
So I'm Ryan Baker, Teachers College, Columbia University, and also the president of the Educational Data Mining Society. The Educational Data Mining Society, educational data mining events have been around since 2005 with a first workshop in Boston, but actually the area was arguably invented right here at CMU, so exciting to be speaking here. There's a lot you can infer from big data in education, and when you have the kind of rich data that edX has, or that other systems like some of the ones Ken showed, you can infer things like complex cognitive skill and whether students have, for example, science inquiry skills. You can infer whether students have learning that not only leads them to do well in the current course, but prepares them for their future learning. You can assess whether students have metacognitive and self-regulated learning skills that help them learn in future contexts. And you can assess their engagement and emotion. And some of the things that we've seen in my research group is that some of those predictions derived from online learning can predict long-term outcomes, like whether students will go to college several years later, in a way that can provide formative information to instructors about why certain students are at risk. So they can be a very powerful tool, potentially, for helping instructors help students who are at risk of not succeeding. These models come out of increasingly, the best ones come out of a very complex process that involves a combination of educational theory and automated data mining techniques. If you think of all the mouse clicks in edX or all of the student interactions in cognitive tutors, there's a lot there. How do we turn that into something meaningful and useful? And educational theory and growing experience in working with this kind of data helps us to be able to mine the meaningful stuff out of the data. And then data mining helps us to search through the billions of potential candidate models of the things we want to infer and predict. And generally, the combination of theory and automated methods lead to better, more general models than either one alone. And as folks have talked about, we can embed these models in a variety of contexts, like automated interventions, more subtle stealth interventions, and reports to instructors, guidance counselors, parents, and students themselves. A couple of challenges, I think, to this becoming as successful as possible and really achieving the kind of visions that we've heard about. First of all, the need for these kind of skills and for educational data mining or learning analytics professionals has outstripped the supply. We need more people who can do these things, who understand analytics and data mining methods, who understand how to do them in educational data and what's special about educational data, and who understand learning in educational settings and what are the specific needs of education. My group has been involved in the last couple years in trying to do trying to help create this cohort, including the creation of this fall in edX. We have an introductory level MOOC, Data Analytics and Learning, which is being led by George Siemens, and Carolyn Rose, who I think is here, is also involved in that. We had a MOOC on Coursera last fall on big data and education. It was at the graduate level, and that's now become an online textbook available for free to anybody in the world. One of the interesting things about doing that is actually how much more motivated people are by the idea of taking a MOOC than using an online textbook. The amount of usage has been massively greater when it was in MOOC form. And we're bringing it back as a MOOC in the spring. Also, graduate programs emerging, including some programs that we're creating at Teachers College in Learning Analytics, including programs in Educational Technology and Applied Learning Sciences here at CMU, and Masters in Learning Sciences and Technologies at Worcester Polytechnic in Massachusetts. One thing I think that the Global Council can do is really try to help bring people together to share resources and to encourage people to create these kind of programs, to create this cohort of people who can do this. I want to save a few seconds for a quick final comment, which is that I think there's a lot we have to figure out about issues of privacy, and we really have to do it in ways that protect student interests. I'm personally not in favor of de-identification in all cases. I think that if you look at the history of education research in universities, institutional review boards do find legitimate cases where identifiers are relevant, and one of those cases is longitudinal research. We have to find ways to protect privacy while still making it possible to figure out what are the long-term impacts of what we do, so that we don't, I was speaking at IES PI meeting yesterday, and one person made the criticism, if you have A/B tests and you only have data from the next day or the next month, you may be selecting towards interventions that have good short-term effects but not good long-term effects. So we need to find ways, I think, to protect privacy while having trusted clearinghouses, like, for example, the National Student Clearinghouse, which has been very successful in college attendance data, that make it possible to make links when people agree that it's okay and when it's under the proper oversight. So I think we currently store a lot of data in education: disciplinary referrals, suspensions, standardized exam scores, grades, and who fails courses. And the data that edX stores, in some cases, can be relatively low risk. So we have to find ways to address the degree of protection we have for the different risk cases and find ways to balance between those needs. So thank you very much.
Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Tom Brock, and I'm with the Institute of Education Sciences. We are the research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. We play several roles. We collect data on student performance at all levels throughout the United States. We conduct evaluations of federal education programs, and we also support research with the intention of learning new ways to improve educational outcomes for students in the United States. One thing that we grapple with all the time at IES is the fact that different groups, different constituencies want different things from research and from data. Obviously, I'm surrounded by a number of colleagues who get very excited about data and its uses. But one thing that continually comes back to us is that out there in the real world, so to speak, in schools and classrooms, the data needs are often much more narrow and much more specific than the kinds of questions that might get asked, say, in federal offices in Washington, D.C., or by academic researchers. Teachers especially, I think, have needs that are very immediate and practical in most cases. Are students that they are working with grasping the material? Where are their students struggling? Where do they need additional help? Are there particular students that are more accelerated and need to go at a faster pace in order to maximize their educational outcomes? So I think for teachers, the data challenge is really to deliver information in ways that they can readily understand and also use while students are still in the classroom. They are not interested, obviously, in getting a report in how students did last year when they've already moved on to the next grade level. For course designers, on the other hand, I think the ultimate objective is to be able to make improvements, to continuously improve the products that they are working with. And we had a wonderful demonstration of that this morning with the Duolingo program. Because their needs are about making improvement, obviously their data needs also shift. And again, we heard about this some this morning. So a good courseware developer is not going to be as interested in what is happening with students in one particular classroom as he or she will be interested in wanting to know what's happening in students in thousands of classrooms in many different settings, students with a wide variety of backgrounds. So here, obviously, we're shifting to an interest in aggregated data, an interest in more representative samples of students. We are interested in using these data for the purposes of identifying underlying patterns in how students are performing over time. And also, as we heard about this morning, using the data to actually manipulate in different ways, different instruments to understand if there are particular ways of delivering information, presenting problem sets to students that are more effective than other ways. Learning scientists, or academics more broadly, I think share many of the same data needs and data interests as course developers have. They're interested, of course, in identifying patterns. They're interested in supporting experimentation of various types. But I think for learning scientists, the questions are a bit broader still. Really going beyond simply how do I improve a particular product to thinking more largely about how, in fact, do students learn? How are students processing information? How are their brains forming new connections? How are students accumulating knowledge and building knowledge over time? With the ultimate goal of really building theory. Theory that we can use to develop new instructional materials, to guide us on pedagogical practice, and so on. Now, another question or issue we struggle with at IES is how to provide good training for the next generation of researchers and developers who are going to be doing this kind of work. And as I've listened to this panel and to the presentations this morning, I'm just really struck by a simple fact, and that is we need collaborative models in how we go about this work going forward. I think in the past, at least for us as a federal funding agency, it's been very easy to kind of think in particular silos. So we have programs for universities to apply for grant funding. We have special funds for small businesses to apply for contracts with the federal government. But I think, in fact, what's needed to advance in this area are collaborative models that bring together at least three perspectives. Certainly the learning scientist perspective to build on what we know about human cognition and student learning. Secondly, the practitioner perspective, as I mentioned a moment ago, really understanding teacher needs on a deep level, understanding student needs and how students are interacting with these programs in the classroom. And then thirdly, understanding the developer perspective, to be able to learn from products that have been developed in the past, what has worked and what hasn't worked so well, to think about issues of marketability and scale, fundamentally important to changing practice, and the type of issue that in general academics and learning scientists are not so good at. So we really need to bring all of these views together. The last point I wanted to comment on was this question about really the opportunity in many ways of collecting and using data in real time, stealth data as it's sometimes called, and wondering whether in fact we're moving into an era in which that can replace standardized testing. I think I would have to say not entirely. I certainly think that there is a role for unobtrusive data collection, and I'm very encouraged actually to see the field moving in this direction. But there are also very legitimate policy needs to assess student performance at various levels, at the school district level, at the state level, at the national level, at the international level. And in order for assessments to be both accurate and reliable, it is still important to be thinking about giving students the same testing materials, to do that for the same types of students, i.e. at the same grade level, at the same point in their educational progress, and under similar testing conditions. So with all the excitement and enthusiasm about these new forms of data collection, I don't want us to lose sight of those other needs. But I do think underlying this question about the opportunities of stealth data is a sense that we do need to move away from some of the high-stakes testing that creates so much needless anxiety for teachers, for students, for the parents of students. And I think the more we can depressurize testing and make it seem like a normal part of the learning process, the better off we as a society will be, certainly the better off our students will be.
So we have one more panelist before Alfred, who, because we don't have enough table space here, is joining us by the phone. That's Carl Wyman. Carl, can you hear us?
Yes.
Great. Take it away.
So I'm at Stanford University, split between the Department of Physics and the School of Education. And I've done a variety of research, both in atomic physics, but also research in learning and teaching physics and science in general, both using technology and online activities and not. And so a lot of what Tom just said, I can just quickly echo. So I'll just kind of dispense with a few things of just giving my agreement in what he was just talking about, the replacement of standardized testing with this stealth data. I mean, the stealth data is clearly very helpful for guiding instructions and seeing what to do to help a particular student and knowing a teacher to know much better where they are. But if you look at standardized testing, I mean, it's you have to look at who wants it and why do they want it. And, you know, that gets into lots of policy and political issues that this kind of data is just, as Tom also said, is just never going to address. So I think that one's kind of easy to dispense with. I also agree with him about the different types of data needed by teachers versus course designers and learning scientists. I think learning scientists in some ways need oftentimes much more limited kinds of data, but much deeper and much more controlled, whereas teachers and course designers use much the same type of data, but the difference is you know, whether it's aggregated and you can look at many different populations versus knowing exactly where Johnny is and what he's struggling with and what will help him. So that's just echoing Tom on those. Let me say a little more about then the personalization, what we mean by personalized learning and what will it accomplish. And I think, you know, this is something that's clearly obviously beneficial. I mean, forget about big data. In a lot of our work, we see that giving college, university instructors, the level I work at, even a little data about their students can make a big impact on how they teach and actually on the student outcomes. But if you think about the value of personalized learning and this data, it's much like we talked about in his talk earlier. I mean, it's like having a very good personal tutor who can recognize just what the state of the learner is, where their understanding is, their motivation is, and then provide them with the right kinds of practice tasks that really target their needs and giving them the feedback that can help that. So I think it's clear what you need and well, it could be accomplished doing that in a realistic, practical, widespread, affordable way is then a different issue. So there also, just a little caveat here that although this kind of, more targeted learning and interventions can make the learning much more engaging and efficient, there are limits, though, because there's some types of learning, such as particularly things like metacognition and scientific argumentation, that are really greatly helped and more likely just require social interaction. And so you can't really think you're going to be able to have every student just locked in front of a computer and accomplish everything you want from that. I guess the only other comments I'd make on this is just as a general comment, hearing a lot of the other comments. I think a certain amount of caution, though, about the big data is important. There's a big difference between lots of data and useful data, and we've seen in our own work, as well as that of others, that people collect lots of data that really doesn't mean very much. And I'll just end here with the example that was given earlier about deciding that 6 minutes was the optimum video time for an online video. I mean, from our studies of in classroom, I can tell you exactly what a teacher can do that'll have all of the students not paying attention after 2 or 3 minutes. I can also show you, tell them what to do and show you examples where a teacher can keep all the students very engaged for 50 minutes. And so you really have to think about what the conditions of the data are, have models for what it's measuring before you really can make sensible interpretations of this thing. So I think that's just a point that has to be kept in mind when one's getting all excited about just having masses of data. It's got to be meaningful data. So thank you.
Thank you.
So
Alfred, bring it all together.
all right, let me try to synthesize this into something that might make some sense. So we heard a number of different things, just a few of them that we heard. So Ken, when you started, you said something I think we should all pay attention to. There's some statistics which say that a personalized algebra tutor is twice as effective. I mean, if there was anything I'd remember from what you said, that's like really powerful, given the degree of difficulty so much of our population has and the huge number of people that basically start tuning out on math and science at the algebra level, at the middle and high school algebra level. What we heard from Matthias is really the large proliferation of programs they have, governmental and quasi-governmental, in and around the space, and the importance, I think, of national platforms, which would be something you might expect there to serve as a basis for some of the experimentation science in the field. We heard from Anant. I think we heard, if we heard anything, we heard they have a lot of data, and that it is plausibly extremely useful, whether the average video or the right video length that's a function of who the teacher is or whatever, that data can all be deduced from this. And I think that's what we learned, and we got a real feel for the difficulty in using it. I did expect when you said the time of a video, I thought it was going to be, given that you're associated near MIT, it was going to be E times the golden mean or something like this. But I was surprised it turned out to an integer number. But maybe, I think it's been said, God created the integers and man created everything else, so maybe that's why. Heidi, I think what you mentioned is something many of us that are involved in privacy feel. It's a very complex subject, right? What we consider to be private information about a certain thing, someone else may not. And what might be acceptable privacy guidelines in one area are not acceptable and something that are exactly the same guidelines but in a different area. So you basically said we're going to have to learn and be adaptive as things occur throughout society. That's at least one of the things that I took from this. Ryan, I think one of the things you mentioned, I believe, is I think that there are different cases involving data. So you've been with this for a long time. There are lots of different uses. I hope you'll excuse me, but I'm going to put this one in a little bit more time in my own words, because as you can imagine at Google, I think about data a lot. So one of the things we think about is, can we glean educational approaches in general based on the data? We could do that maybe post facto with Anant's data. We could look at it all and see what's the right length video, or what colors to use, or who knows what kind of things. That's how do we glean large-scale data. That's how, for example, in the internet world, we do spelling. So we learn from all the misspellings and corrected spellings on the web to do spelling correction. It's an analogous thing. There are really no privacy implications to that. Almost everyone loves it. It's a good thing. There's really no risk. There's individualized education, what we might do to help an individual. That's something that's an important use. We have to be very careful with that because we can be wrong, and we can send someone on a path that's incorrect. So that's a place where it's a lot more delicate. In the internet world, that has an analogy, an analog of recommendations, right? Recommendations from movies on Netflix or on Google Now or on Amazon. That's that kind of an analog. That data is, needless to say, very sensitive in that world, but the risks are lower. God forbid we get a bad movie recommendation. It's not as bad as being sent to the wrong science class. There's another thing in terms of something that I don't see an analog in the web, and that is that a lot are interested in whether all of the data throughout our path through educational systems is going to be valuable for ourselves and perhaps our employees as either an enabling or a gating collection of data, right? Is the fact that I didn't do well in tensor math, should that have, the physicists probably maybe should have rejected me based on that. Maybe that's true, or maybe not. So how do we use that data? The fact that I did do well in computer science, I needed that, that was useful, that was really useful for me to pay attention to that. That's a kind of thing we don't have so much on the web. There are profound implications to that data use. And then finally, there's public policy use of data, which you mentioned. And that exists, there are analogs on the web with things like Google Trends, when you can look at search frequencies and such things, Google Correlate, that have public policy implications. You're really interested in that. People have thought about all sorts of uses for that data, and that also exists. My take on this privacy issue, one that is not always agreed upon, is that really you have to be guided in what you do with privacy by the intended use of the data. You can't say that there's one way of dealing with data independent of use. It's very much usage-based, which requires some degree of trust by the user community, or perhaps even regulatory structures of some form, that while there'll be large collections of data, it's only used in prescribed fashions. So that's one of the topics that came up. You brought this up as well. You mentioned strongly that we need to have the ability to get many data from many different uses, and I hopefully covered some of that in that taxonomy here. You also mentioned that there needs to be a coming together in the research world of many different contributors to this, whether the course developer, the practitioner, the data analyst, and the like. And I think that's certainly true. Carl, it was thank you for joining by teleconference. It's very hard to do, I know, and we're sorry you couldn't be here. You also mentioned, in many cases, the challenges with data, the challenge in personalization, the enormous challenge with large data when you don't know the assumptions under which it's collected, for example. So it can often be quite hard to utilize. The one thing I would just mention, just to act as a sounding board on that, is, again, think of the analog in the internet space. A large-scale search engine, like ours or our competitors in this country or overseas, probably generates somewhere on the order of 10 to the 4th to 10 to the 7th times more data per unit time than an enterprise search engine does for even a medium-sized enterprise of 1,000 people. So if you think about that, the search engines have to learn from what users like and don't like, et cetera. That's one of the key aspects. So they're learning systems. It means that a global search engine, an internet-based search engine, may learn in 1 second what it takes 100,000 seconds, which is a day, approximately, to learn within an enterprise search engine. And that's the reason why people that use search within their enterprise tend to say, how come the X search engine in the world works better than my own company's does. It's because they learn 100,000 times faster on average. And that's something to keep in mind as we think about the opportunities of shared data in the world. 100,000 times. We often think in science that a factor of 10 is a qualitative difference. This is 10 to the fifth or 10 to the fourth that may be happening versus what an institution of even a medium and large scale can go do. So I would like to encourage people to come up and ask questions on this. I will just start while folks are congregating to the microphone, but I don't want to take too long with this and dominate this myself. I was going to ask a question, Tom, for you. So we hear anecdotal evidence of tremendous breakthroughs with the use of online technology and, for example, Ken's comment on algebra. How come we don't see more of this actually rolling out into the world more broadly? How come it's so small still? And what can your team do to legitimize this and then essentially generate all the data and believable results that would get the world to change?
Yeah. That's a good question and one we struggle with all the time. I think we do have a gap between the research that's being done and what we're learning and our ability to actually influence practice in the field. In part, I think we do have a communications challenge. I don't think we as a research community have always done a good job of presenting information in ways that policymakers or practitioners can readily understand and act upon. So that is part of it. I think as well, though, we're coming to learn that even the best communication isn't going to necessarily change practice or behavior in the field. So we're increasingly, I think, coming to the view that we need to be looking at possibly some kinds of intermediary models, ways of providing greater technical assistance and supports to those in the field to learn from and adapt particular materials to their own uses. Frequently, that is a missing link, I think, in this work. There have been some innovations, I think, within the Department of Education, and just to give credit to Jim Shelton in particular and some of my colleagues there around the Office of Innovation and Improvement. So taking this idea that people, school districts that is, or other groups can come requesting funds based on the evidence that's behind particular initiatives or things that they would like to adopt. And depending on the level of evidence, they might be able to request a relatively small grant if the evidence base is small, or a much larger grant if indeed there have been many studies backing up a particular approach that they want to adapt for their particular uses and circumstances.
Does someone else want to comment on that?
Sure, just a very quick thing. You mentioned the big gap between researchers and educators. You have researchers doing education and what's good for research, and you have educators who teach. And I think if it takes 100,000 times as long to get the evidence, I think it takes glacial years to translate research from papers into the classroom. And I think that is why I'm a really big believer in this concept of educator-engineer, where through A/B testing and online platforms like the one I mentioned earlier, I think we can make that loop as small as possible by making the educator, professor, instructor, the engineer themselves. So they do the experiments themselves, and it's highly motivating when you can see the benefits of what you're doing yourself.
Very good. Okay, let's go to our first stalwart questioner.
Hello. I have a question.
Could you identify yourself as well?
I'm Michael Dudelson. I'm with Carnegie Learning. I have a question to all panelists and moderators alike. Could you share maybe a couple of big questions pertaining to learning that you hope big data would be helpful to solve? And maybe there's some roadblocks along the way, and maybe there are already some secret weapons, to borrow Herb Simon's terminology, that we already have at our disposal. Thank you.
Someone like to take that? Some things that they feel data could solve. Perhaps Ryan, something you
Sure.
could take a crack at that one first.
I didn't quite hear the end of the question, Michael. I apologize, but
Maybe there are, these questions should be big questions. Are there any roadblocks that make them really big? And maybe there are already some tools that we already have at our disposal that would help us solve part of these big questions, but we're not there yet.
So, to me, one of the big things that you see happen in education is that a lot of kids show up in early years of their education very excited about learning and very excited about a lot of careers and end up falling out of the pipeline. I think that big data, especially longitudinal data, can help us identify better. I think one of the big questions is, where are the key moments that in a student's experience that cause them to become one of the students who drops out? Can we identify it earlier than previously possible and in more actionable ways? So what are the actionable levers and moments where we can make a difference? And I think that the roadblocks are that, first of all, we don't know what to do with the data. We don't entirely know what the variables are meaningful. And we haven't been very good at getting good longitudinal data linked together. We have a lot of great data in a lot of places. A lot of that data is not easily mappable to each other. I think that resolving those challenges might make us more able to figure out why students are at risk and what we can do about it, and do the right thing at the right time to help them.
Kim, is that one you have as
well?
well?
I think the biggest issue is this: how do we get long-term dependent measures? We do A/B testing.
The use of big data and the open use of research data in Germany. The question is who generates the quality, who controls the quality, who guarantees the quality of research data, and at the end, who pays for the quality of data. And from some perspectives, maybe this is the biggest portion of the cost of big data to ensure the quality of it. And the second question is, which came to me, what big data cannot describe. For example, in the interaction between a teacher and a student, between a professor and a student, where maybe the direction of teaching and the direction of learning is not clear. It's not a one-way street. So in a relation between persons, what are things which cannot be described?
Okay. All right, can we get to the next question?
Hello.
Oh, I'm sorry, I beg your pardon. I should have looked to the right.
Sorry about that.
To the left.
Hello, Nicole Pinkard from DePaul University. So I have a question building off of Ryan, what you just stated. It's about big data, and oftentimes it seems like what we're talking about is data around classes, what's taking place in instructional units. But I think one of the things we also know that school is about teaching, you learn, but then it's about the application of it in the real world. And part of what's different from students from different socioeconomic backgrounds is the whole ecosystem that surrounds them. So I'm curious about, as we think about big data, how we begin to think about other types of data sets, like your informal learning experiences that can all come together, create that whole pathway, that whole longitude. Took robotics, what did you do US first? How do we begin to understand the connections between these to help us understand who's dropping out and who's not dropping out? And then the last thing with that is, maybe even if we had the data sets, but we look back retrospectively once we realize, hey, in Pittsburgh, there's these 100 young ladies who are now in college in STEM. What was it about their experiences that we can now backwards map and understand this? So is anyone beginning to look into those, that area of work?
What a fantastic question. So, Ryan, go ahead.
I think that's a great area. I think it's hard for many of the exact reasons you put out. Linking that data can be very difficult. There is one group I know of in New York, Teachly, that's been working at creating a platform that can integrate educational game data from out-of-school experiences with in-class data, but that's still very far from what you're talking about. I think you brought up another issue there that I think is really important, which is understanding context and understanding different populations. One of the things that I think log data can be very good for, and a lot of these new sources of data, is getting data on kids that were previously not easy to get data on. I remember from one point in my graduate school days, driving out to schools that were really far away to collect data. A lot of researchers don't want to go out to rural areas. A lot of researchers don't want to go to very poor urban areas. So even though log data doesn't address all what you're talking about, I do think that it helps us at least get more in-school data for populations that were being ignored previously.
So you talked about several kinds of correlations, both in class and online. You talked about over time. The one example I can think of is when you talked about relationships between peers and social connections and groups. I know one group, Jennifer DeBoer and others are doing some studies on, and others actually are doing some studies on how people build reputations in discussion forums. When a student asks a question on a discussion forum, a number of people answer questions. How does the student who decides on which is a good answer, how do they judge the reputation? How do people build reputations? How do they build connections? In fact, just an hour ago, I was in the room back there, and I noticed a really cool experiment that Carolyn and Emily and others from CMU, along with George Siemens and others doing the edX platform, where they built a tool on the open edX platform and offering a course on edX where when a student, they offer a help button, a student asks for help, and then they connect it to a number of other people in the course, and they're studying how does the person who gets help choose which of those people they want to get help from. And so they're looking at social connections in various ways. And so that's one example, I guess, of these lateral or longitudinal correlations.
I think it was a great question. If I can use my prerogative just to answer it a little bit myself, you'll excuse me. I think it's of growing importance as well. So YouTube and related video sites are huge educational vehicles for actually very large segments of society. So what are people learning? I mean, it's a big market segment for Google in that. Online libraries, online music for music education wasn't available. People didn't have certain kinds of music you could find. Now it's essentially available to everyone. Online blogs, Wikipedia, and many, many more things are there. So there's so much information that's available to many of our students. Our role in the formal education process is a decreasing percentage. How much it will decrease, I think, is subject to debate, but it's a decreasing percentage. So if all we do is monitor the formality of a classroom experience or a Mooc, we're clearly missing a lot, and we'll be missing an increasing amount. So but it's a very tough nut to crack for reasons like, whatever privacy questions came up earlier got multiplied 10x by the kinds of things I just said.
My name is Derek Lomas. I'm a PhD student with Ken Koedinger, also an entrepreneur. Typical R&D spending across the industries is about 3%, and government, it's also about 3%. Across all government spending in education, it's less than 1%. In that context, we're seeing this vast new possibility for measurement where the challenges of driving out to a rural school to run a randomized controlled trial is inverted by the ability to run a randomized controlled trial with thousands of students in a single day, where now the challenge is less of recruitment, but how do you take advantage of all of the subject that you have available to you. So in this context, it seems that there's a need for envisioning a kind of research infrastructure that is much broader and has a more integrative perspective. There are so many little questions to address, but when we have both the opportunity and the need, what do you think we should be envisioning in a large-scale educational infrastructure to drive education forward in the future?
So Heidi, do you want to think about that from a privacy perspective? Is it too soon to contemplate that because we don't know enough from the privacy world, or do you think we could thread the needle?
So from an infrastructure perspective, like what we would need in terms of platforms to make it happen and how it works, that was like one of the things I would have addressed in the opening statement if I had had enough time. But the example that I actually go to is Google and Microsoft in Google Apps for Education and what Microsoft offered starting probably about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that, to pilot these programs where they were offering free solutions for education in terms of infrastructure and platform. And it was the kind of situation where higher ed didn't know what they could get from it until somebody showed it to them. And I don't think even Google or Microsoft understood the power of what they were even offering. There were different motivating factors, but when that was presented, it was like a match made in heaven, except that there were a lot of privacy issues from an infrastructure standpoint in terms of what data was moving where, how it was being collected, where it was being stored, how long it was being stored for. And there were all these sort of odd ends that didn't get hammered out until the programs were already being rolled out. But there was a lot of pushback. It was definitely a look before you leap situation, and people were running ahead with it and then having to pull back and saying, wait a minute, we screwed up. We should have asked more questions. We should have negotiated on both sides, right? This was not, I'm not trying to demonize the solutions and the infrastructure that were offered. There were issues that Google and Microsoft didn't understand that they had to address, and they had perhaps opened themselves up to liability as well. And it was an evolution, and it's still evolving. It was still an ongoing discussion about what that was going to look like in a way that made both sides happy. And so from an infrastructure perspective and in terms of what is needed to do research and data research, I think it's a similar thing where I feel like I'm beginning to sound like a broken record, but it really is this sort of like test, take a look at it, figure out what worked and what didn't work, and move forward. But there's this massive supply and demand issue as well. And basically, there's clearly a need for different types of data, for, as much as I hate it, more data, but ways to do that in a really sort of targeted, focused way, to develop things like retention and destruction programs as we're building out this massive infrastructure to understand, to maybe rein in our tendency for data hoarding. But I think all of those pieces have to come together to build the right infrastructure. But the spur of all of it is a supply and demand issue. Somebody has to be the, what's the name of the app that now I can't remember, the Duolingo of the space. Somebody has to say, there's a need here and I'm gonna come in and meet it. And then all the details get hammered out as time goes on. Clearly there's a need. Nobody's risen to say, I'm developing the infrastructure or the platform specifically to address this, and these are the privacy issues that come along with that, and I've thought of that. That hasn't seemed to happen in that focused of a way yet in this space.
Carl?
But it's happening.
So Carl, maybe if you could have, arbitrarily large funding for physics platforms for global physics education, that might help to answer the question. Any thoughts on what you could do if you could get Tom to fund this or something? I don't know if he would be willing, but I'm smiling at him as I say this.
I think this really emphasizes the limitations here, because we already have lots of data showing things that students have trouble with, showing much more effective ways to teach them than what's being used in the classrooms. And we can't get those into the classrooms. We can't get the teachers that there's not a culture of using evidence to drive education. There's a culture of using history and superstition to handle education. And so I think that in some ways you need the data is not the primary limit right now, and so until you get past that hurdle, the question of what you would gain by this wonderful platform is a little hard to decide.
Okay, thank you very much. A pragmatic answer from a practitioner. Another question.
Thank you. My name is John Danaher, and I'm from Elsevier. I have a proposition that I would like your reaction to, and that is, I actually believe, and I think we believe, that the promise of big data in education is even more robust than the panel has described. And I'll put forward what I perceive are two outputs or two outcomes of it, and I'll just put forth a thesis of how we achieve these outcomes or these outputs. So the first one is, I think there's the opportunity to truly understand how the individual student learns optimally. And so I don't think the question is going to be so much, is it a 6-minute video or a 12-minute video or a 3-minute video, but more fundamental questions such as, does the learner learn best? Are they auditory learners? Are they visual learners? And how best to serve up the data. So that's the first thesis. And then the second thesis about big data in education is that it really can, at the individual student level, be very instrumental in understanding the skills, competencies, and proficiencies that the student has mastered. And when you think about that, and you think about in some of the earlier sessions in the morning, the idea of lifelong learning and portfolios, et cetera, how important it is, there were various analogies used with pilots and doctors and things like that, how important it is for employers in the employment setting to know the skills, competencies, and proficiencies and that the individual employees have, and to offer lifelong learning. And so the underpinning of my thesis and proposition is that when you take content and you truly optimize the content, you tag, you meta tag, you create taxonomies, you create ontologies, you create structures, etc. And when you take assessments and marry assessments throughout optimized content, and then you marry that all to recommendation engines, algorithms, etc., that you can achieve as the outputs some of those things, that you can achieve data and information that allow you to perform better, graduate, etc., but have good insight. So I'd love reactions to that.
Just to get it started, let me make a comment. So those of us in America have always taken our hat off to Germany for the apprentice system that you've operated, which has been so phenomenally successful for an enormous part of your population. This seems like this sort of thinking is sort of a natural idea that would apply to that form of education. Are you thinking about that in Germany, or do you know if it's being discussed, how this could apply to help people find the optimal apprenticeships and to demonstrate their capabilities as they enter the wonderful manufacturing sector in Germany and related areas?
I think only partial. I think in this era we have now the problem that more and more young people want to go to university, and the companies offering apprenticeship places have not enough young people to fill these positions. This is a major problem. And there's a wonderful way, I would say, we see in Germany that more and more it's combined, a study going for a bachelor grade and apprenticeship education. So you could go for both.
Okay. Any other more direct comments on the question?
Short responses. I believe I agree with your propositions.
Okay. I think all of us are very optimistic. In varying degrees, we're leery of privacy and practicality issues that get in the way, but I think we're all probably pretty optimistic if we're here. Let's get one more question. I think that's all that we have time for, or else someone will get the hook.
Hi, I'm Michelle.
Can you turn your microphone
Yeah,
down?
trying there, sorry. I'm Michelle Cahill from Carnegie Corporation. We're a philanthropy that's invested in this area a lot, with one big failure, which was in Bloom this year. And the reason, the question is about security, privacy, public confidence, and how we can overcome the barriers that exist between, or that are at least preventing even a constructive conversation about security and data privacy in K-12 education and lack of trust in government. Because one of the big barriers came from state legislatures who essentially were not questioning whether this nonprofit was collecting data that would be used in a wrong way. Some other people thought that and didn't understand the work, and that it was bad interoperability. But what they essentially were saying is, we don't trust government having student data. And without something, doesn't have to be this solution, but an interoperability system in K-12, the costs for making this transition is so high.
Tom, do you have any thoughts on this? Or?
It's a very good and very tough question. I think certainly there is some reason for the public suspicion of government, and every time you have a situation like the NSA, for instance, that sets us back, I think, years in terms of the ability to use data for some of the more productive and positive purposes that we've talked about. I will say certainly within the federal government there are people working on these issues, but where I have actually seen the most progress and the most hope is in some states that have taken the lead on these issues, that see an advantage to linking data sets across systems, for instance. Employment and educational systems is just one example. Currently, very few states make that possible, and yet so many state policymakers want to know, are our colleges and universities preparing students well for the labor force? So as we begin to see some progress in certain states, I'm actually more hopeful that some of those systems will spread and that the trust will begin to build. It probably will have to happen, I suspect, at that level rather than from the top down at the federal level.
Anant, you made a comment on the whole large data trove. Any thoughts you have on this one as a penultimate comment here?
I just have a facetious comment on this, I think, which is that, as far as data privacy and trust and suspicion is concerned, I think it's not a question of who you trust or who you suspect. I think it's a question of who you suspect less. So if my data is with somebody, I'm suspicious, period. Whether it's the government, whether it's my grandmother, or whether it is a for-profit company. But frankly, I think the issue is who do you suspect less? And you go with the one you suspect least.
Ken, can we leave it with you for the last word, since I think that would be symmetric? You started, so.
Well, I guess a quick comment on this. It does seem similar that a combination of private efforts, and I do think the educational technology industry is booming. There's lots of opportunity. Duolingo is an interesting example of it this morning, but there's so many, small and big companies getting into this game. So they, in addition to government, may provide some solutions that I think the In Bloom ideal come back in some form, and maybe some diversity of efforts will make it possible. So yes.
I'd like to thank the panel. We'd like to thank the panel.
Indeed.
Thank you so much for your work. I believe we have ended approximately on time. So thank you.
We have a break now until 3 o'clock, so get some coffee, soda.